A yellow slip of paper fluttered against the garage door, taped there before sunrise by someone who never bothered to knock. $50, it said, for a trash can left at the curb 10 minutes past the posted hour. The man who found it did not curse or tear it down. He simply read it twice, folded it in half, and set it on the workbench beside his coffee. Within the week, 3 women in matching Navy uniforms would stand in his driveway insisting they had the authority to handcuff him and drag him away. They had no idea that the quiet, composed man in front of them had spent years of his life being trained for exactly this kind of pressure, and that every lie they told was about to collapse in front of cameras they never thought to look for. Ethan Brooks had moved into Maple Hollow Estates only 6 weeks earlier, drawn by the wide sidewalks, the old oak trees, and the promise of a slower life after years of moving from base to base. He was 39 years old, broad-shouldered but soft-spoken, the kind of man who held doors open and remembered the names of children he had only met once. Nobody in the neighborhood knew that he had spent the better part of 2 decades in the United States Marine Corps, much of it in roles that demanded absolute control under chaos. He never mentioned it. When people asked what he used to do for work, he simply said he had served and left it there. Within his first week, he was already fixing what needed fixing. He noticed the fence behind the Delgado family, leaning after a storm, and spent a Saturday afternoon repairing it without being asked. He mowed the lawn of an elderly widower 2 doors down every single week, refusing payment each time it was offered. He carried grocery bags for a woman on crutches and helped a teenager jumpstart a dead battery in the rain. Word spread quickly that the new man on Birchwood Lane was the kind of neighbor people hoped for, patient, capable, and never looking for credit. Ethan kept a small routine that rarely changed, waking before dawn out of a habit that had never quite left him, running 2 miles down the quiet streets while the neighborhood still slept. He came home, showered, made a single cup of black coffee, and spent the rest of his mornings working from a small home office, doing consulting work for a logistics company that valued his discipline far more than it valued his silence about the past. In the evenings, he read, tended a modest vegetable garden along the side of his house, and occasionally sat on his porch simply watching the street the way a man does when he has finally stopped needing to watch for danger. Nothing about his days was remarkable, and that, more than anything, was exactly how he wanted it after so many years of a life that had rarely allowed for anything ordinary at all. Among the people who noticed him most closely was George Ferris, 72 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Maple Hollow longer than almost anyone. George sat on his porch most afternoons, watching the street the way older men often do, cataloging who came and went and what kind of person they seemed to be. He liked Ethan immediately, not because of anything the younger man said, but because of the way he moved through the world, calm, deliberate, never wasting emotion or a word. George had seen that kind of stillness before, and it always meant something had been tempered by fire long before it reached him. George himself had spent 3 decades teaching history to teenagers who rarely appreciated it at the time, though many had written him letters years later admitting otherwise, and in that career he had learned to recognize the particular quiet of someone who had lived through more than they let on. He had a nephew who served 2 tours overseas and came home with that same unhurried watchfulness, the same habit of sitting with his back to a wall in any room he entered, and George noticed Ethan doing exactly the same thing the first time he invited him in for coffee. Over the weeks that followed, a quiet friendship formed between the 2 men, built mostly around small favors and short conversations on George's porch in the evenings. George told stories about the neighborhood as it used to be, back when the association barely existed, and neighbors settled disagreements over a fence line with nothing more than a conversation and a handshake, and Ethan listened more than he spoke, as he did with most things. What George also knew, better than most, was that Maple Hollow's Homeowners Association ran the neighborhood less like a community and more like a small kingdom. At the center of that kingdom sat Vanessa Holloway, 48 years old, president of the association for the past 6 years, a woman who treated every rule in the bylaws as though it had been handed down from a higher power. She wore blazers to backyard barbecues and carried a clipboard the way other people carried phones. Beside her, nodding along to nearly everything she said, was Linda Shaw, 45, a board member who had long since stopped having opinions of her own. Vanessa liked to remind new residents, often within their first conversation, that Maple Hollow was not like other neighborhoods. She would smile thinly and say the same line she had said to dozens of newcomers before Ethan. Here, the rules of the association are the law, and the law does not bend for anyone. Most people laughed it off as harmless enthusiasm for order. George knew better. He had watched Vanessa levy fines for holiday lights strung one day past the approved date, for a basketball hoop left in a driveway overnight, for a flag flown at what she deemed the wrong angle. Nobody had ever pushed back hard enough to test her, and that fact alone seemed to feed something in her that grew a little bigger every year. Ethan's first brush with the association came on a Tuesday morning, when he stepped outside to find that yellow slip taped to his garage door. The fine cited a violation of Section 14, subsection 3, regarding the timely removal of waste receptacles from the curb. He had wheeled his trash can back only 10 minutes after the posted collection window, a small thing by any reasonable measure, yet the notice demanded $50 within 7 days or a penalty would be added. He read it standing barefoot on the driveway in the early light, then walked back inside and placed it calmly on the counter, deciding he would ask a simple question before paying anything at all. That question, when he finally sat across from Vanessa Holloway at the clubhouse 2 days later, was almost embarrassingly plain. He asked to see the specific bylaw provision that established the 10-minute grace period as a violation worthy of a fine, along with the enforcement procedure that authorized the fee. Vanessa flipped through a binder without finding the page she wanted, insisted the rule existed regardless of whether she could locate it that moment, and told him the fine stood either way. Ethan thanked her for her time, said he would wait for documentation before submitting payment, and left the clubhouse with the same unhurried calm he had walked in with. Vanessa watched him go with an expression George, sitting nearby, would later describe as the look of a woman who had just been told no for the first time in a very long while. It did not take long for the association to escalate. Within days, new complaints began appearing in Ethan's mailbox, each one more trivial than the last. His trash cans, they claimed, had been left visible from the street on a day they should have been hidden behind the fence. His lawn, freshly mowed 48 hours earlier, was flagged as exceeding the maximum permitted height by what the notice called a noticeable margin. His truck, parked squarely within the driveway lines, was cited for sitting a few inches over an imaginary boundary nobody could quite explain. Even his mailbox, still the original fixture installed by the builder, was suddenly deemed the wrong shade of black under the community's approved color palette. One notice arrived claiming his porch light bulb emitted a shade of white, considered too bright under the association's newly invented lighting guideline, a guideline that appeared nowhere in any document Ethan had been given when he purchased the house. Another accused him of storing a kayak in his garage, in a manner visible through the window, a violation Vanessa herself seemed to have invented on the spot after peering through his garage door one afternoon while he was at the grocery store. When he asked politely how she had come to observe the interior of his garage from the public street, she simply said association business permitted reasonable inspection, an answer that satisfied no one, least of all him. Each new complaint felt less like an attempt to maintain community standards and more like a test, a series of small provocations meant to see how long it would take before he finally lost his composure. Ethan responded to each notice the same way, calmly and in writing, asking for the specific rule, the specific measurement, and the specific process by which a resident could appeal. Vanessa never produced satisfying answers, but she also never backed down, each unanswered question seeming to harden her position rather than soften it. During one exchange in the clubhouse parking lot, with Linda Shaw standing a step behind her nodding along, Vanessa finally lost the practiced pleasantness she usually wore in public. She told Ethan, loud enough for 2 other residents to hear, that if he refused to pay what he owed, the association would find other ways to handle it. Ethan simply nodded, thanked her again, and walked to his truck without raising his voice even once. Vanessa cited a laundry list of infractions in rapid succession, each one delivered with the flat certainty of someone reading from a script she had used many times before. She claimed his trash cans had been left visible from the street on a day they should have been hidden behind the fence, that his lawn had exceeded the maximum permitted height by a noticeable margin, and that his truck sat crookedly within the driveway lines by several inches. Ethan listened to each accusation without interruption, waiting until she finished before responding with the same simple request he had made from the very beginning. He asked to see the written policy, the specific measurement standard, and the appeals process, phrasing it politely enough that even Vanessa struggled to find a reason to refuse outright. When she still could not produce a single satisfying answer, she resorted instead to repeating herself louder, as though volume alone might substitute for documentation. That night, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, Ethan replayed the conversation in his mind, not with anger but with the quiet, analytical patience that had once kept him alive in far more dangerous rooms than a suburban clubhouse. He understood even then that Vanessa Holloway was the kind of person who mistook silence for weakness and calm for surrender. He also understood, from long experience, that people like her rarely stopped on their own. They needed to be met with something they had never encountered before, not aggression, but an immovable, documented, unshakable kind of composure. He decided, without telling anyone, that from that point forward, he would keep his own records of everything that happened on his property. The following week, the association held one of its closed-door meetings in the back room of the clubhouse, the kind of meeting residents were never invited to and rarely even knew occurred. Vanessa sat at the head of the table, Linda beside her, and across from them sat a woman named Crystal, 35 years old, who ran a small private security staffing company out of a strip mall on the edge of town. Vanessa had used Crystal's services once before, for crowd control at a community festival, and remembered how convincingly official her staff had looked in their navy uniforms and polished boots. She explained to Crystal exactly what she wanted this time, something with a bit more weight to it, something that would make a certain resident understand who really held authority in Maple Hollow. Crystal listened with obvious enthusiasm, the kind of enthusiasm that should have worried anyone paying close attention. She suggested outfitting her staff with uniforms nearly identical to municipal police attire, dark navy fabric, silver badges purchased online that closely mimicked official shields, and utility belts complete with handcuffs that were, in fact, entirely real. She proposed calling the team HOA enforcement officers, a title with no legal standing whatsoever but one that sounded, to an unsuspecting homeowner, uncomfortably close to actual law enforcement. Linda voiced a brief, half-hearted concern about whether any of this was legal, but Vanessa waved it away, insisting the association had every right to enforce its own rules by whatever means necessary. Crystal smiled and said she could have a team ready within the week, and that they would even record the encounter, in her words, to keep everyone honest. Vanessa spent the following days almost giddy with anticipation, mentioning the plan to Linda more than once, as though it were the solution to every frustration the association had ever caused her. She imagined the scene in vivid detail, Ethan finally rattled, finally apologetic, finally understanding that questioning her authority carried real consequences. She drafted a short statement in her head that she planned to deliver once he capitulated, something about respect for the community and the importance of following rules, though she never once considered that the rules being broken that morning would be her own. Linda, for her part, grew quieter as the days passed, occasionally raising small objections that Vanessa brushed aside without a second thought. By Friday evening, 3 uniforms hung pressed and ready in Crystal's office, 3 sets of handcuffs polished and waiting, and 3 women preparing themselves for a confrontation none of them fully understood the weight of. What none of them discussed, and what none of them seemed to consider even briefly, was that recording the encounter would end up working against them rather than for them. Vanessa was consumed by the idea of finally breaking the calm of the one resident who had dared to question her, certain that the mere sight of uniforms and handcuffs would be enough to make him fold. She had misjudged plenty of people over the years, but never quite so completely as she was about to misjudge Ethan Brooks. The meeting ended with handshakes and a plan, 3 vehicles, 3 uniformed staff, and a visit scheduled for the following Saturday morning, when Vanessa assumed the street would be quiet enough that nobody but Ethan would notice. Saturday arrived with a mild autumn sky, the kind of morning George Ferris usually spent on his porch with a mug of black coffee and the newspaper he still had delivered out of habit. He was in his usual chair when he saw 3 black SUVs turn onto Birchwood Lane in tight formation, moving with a deliberateness that made his stomach tighten before he even understood why. They pulled up in front of Ethan's driveway and parked at odd, aggressive angles, the kind of positioning George associated with television dramas rather than real life. 3 women stepped out in matching navy uniforms, badges glinting under the morning sun, one of them already reaching for a phone to begin recording. George set down his coffee and watched, some old instinct telling him this was not going to be an ordinary Saturday. Ethan was in his garage when he heard the car doors slam, and he stepped out onto the driveway with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything else. Crystal walked toward him first, flanked by 2 other women whose uniforms bore patches that said HOA enforcement in stiff embroidered letters. She informed him, in a tone rehearsed to sound authoritative, that he was currently obstructing a lawful enforcement action, and that continued non-compliance would result in his detention. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, taking in the badge, the belt, the handcuffs clipped at her hip, and asked a single, simple question in a voice that never rose above conversational volume. He asked which agency, department, or municipal authority had commissioned her as an officer with the power to detain anyone. Crystal hesitated, glancing briefly toward Vanessa, who stood near the SUV with her arms crossed and her jaw set. She repeated that she was acting on behalf of the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association, as though the name itself carried legal weight, and told Ethan again that he needed to comply immediately. Ethan asked, just as evenly as before, whether the association had any legal authority to detain a private citizen on his own property, a question none of the 3 women seemed prepared to answer. Instead of answering, Crystal took a step forward and reached out to grab his arm, the motion sudden and unmistakably intended to intimidate rather than communicate. It was, without her realizing it, the exact kind of unprovoked physical contact that years of training had taught Ethan to recognize and neutralize in the space of a single breath. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Though to the small crowd of neighbors now gathering on porches and driveways, it seemed to unfold in perfect, almost cinematic slow motion. Ethan shifted his weight only slightly, redirected Crystal's grip with an open palm, and stepped a half pace to the side, the movement so economical it barely looked like movement at all. Crystal, who had put her full weight behind the grab, stumbled forward off balance and had to catch herself against the hood of her own SUV to avoid falling. Nobody had been struck, nobody had been harmed, and yet the message could not have been clearer to everyone watching. The calm, polite new neighbor was not the easy target Vanessa Holloway had assumed him to be. For a moment, nobody on the driveway moved at all, the silence stretching just long enough for the weight of what had happened to settle over everyone present. Crystal straightened herself against the SUV, breathing hard, her earlier confidence replaced by something closer to confusion, as though her body had expected resistance to feel entirely different than this. Ethan had not raised his voice, had not clenched a fist, had not so much as stepped fully out of a neutral, relaxed stance, and somehow that made the outcome feel even more decisive than if he had. A teenager watching from across the street later told his mother, it looked like the man had simply stepped out of the way and let physics do the rest. An observation that was not far from the truth. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out, the plan she had been so certain of already beginning to feel considerably less certain in her hands. Vanessa's face flushed red as she watched her plan begin to unravel in real time, and rather than reconsidering, she leaned further into the mistake she had already made. She shouted at the other 2 women to restrain him immediately, her voice cracking with the kind of desperation that comes from watching control slip away in public. The 2 remaining staff members exchanged a nervous glance before moving toward Ethan together, one reaching for his wrist while the other fumbled with the handcuffs at her belt. Ethan's response was, once again, almost unsettlingly efficient, a series of small deflections and controlled holds that separated the 2 women from him without ever crossing into anything that could reasonably be called violence. Within seconds, one woman found her own wrist gently but firmly guided behind her back, not restrained, simply immobilized long enough for her to understand resistance was pointless, while the other lost her grip on the handcuffs entirely, the metal clattering onto the concrete driveway. Ethan stepped back the moment both women were clearly no longer a threat, raising his hand slightly to show he intended no further contact, and speaking loudly enough now for the gathering neighbors to hear clearly. He explained, in the same unhurried tone he had used from the beginning, that he had not struck anyone, had not initiated any contact, and had only acted to prevent an unlawful physical restraint against himself on his own property. Several neighbors had already begun filming with their phones, capturing everything from the initial grab to the fumbled handcuffs on the pavement, footage that would matter enormously in the hours to come. George Ferris, still on his porch, had also pulled out his own phone the moment the SUVs arrived, some old teacher's instinct telling him documentation would matter later. Vanessa, red-faced and visibly shaking with anger rather than fear, shouted that Ethan was resisting a lawful enforcement action, though nobody watching believed her anymore. It was at that exact moment that a young mother, 2 houses down, who had been filming from her porch since the SUVs first arrived, shouted the words that changed the entire trajectory of the morning. She announced, loudly enough for the whole street to hear, that she had already called the real police, and that they were on their way. Vanessa's expression shifted instantly from fury to something closer to panic, though she tried, unsuccessfully, to mask it behind a stiff, insistent posture. Crystal, still rubbing her shoulder from the stumble against the SUV, looked suddenly far less confident than she had 10 minutes earlier. Linda Shaw, who had stayed near the vehicles the entire time and said almost nothing, began edging backward as though physical distance might somehow protect her from what was coming. The neighborhood, once quiet and unremarkable, had become the site of a standoff nobody could pretend was ordinary anymore. Officer Ryan Cole arrived 12 minutes later, parking his marked patrol car at the curb and stepping out with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who had learned long ago never to rush into a scene before understanding it. He was 34 years old, a 6-year veteran of the department, and it took him only a few seconds of scanning the driveway to register that something about this situation did not add up. 3 women stood near black SUVs, wearing uniforms that resembled police attire but were not quite right, the badges too shiny, the patches spelling out words no real department used. He asked, calmly but firmly, for everyone to remain exactly where they were while he sorted out what had happened, and the authority in his voice was immediate and unmistakable in a way Crystal's uniform had never managed to be. Ryan began with Crystal, asking to see her identification and any documentation establishing her authority to detain civilians. She produced a business card for her private security staffing company, along with a laminated badge that, on closer inspection, had clearly been purchased from an online costume retailer rather than issued by any government body. He asked whether her SUV was registered as any kind of law enforcement or municipal vehicle, and when she admitted it was her personal car, the last of her composure visibly cracked. He turned next to Vanessa, asking who had authorized this operation and under what legal framework a homeowners association believed it could detain, handcuff, or physically restrain a resident. Vanessa began speaking quickly, citing bylaws and violations and years of precedent, none of which answered the actual question he had asked. He walked the length of the driveway slowly, examining the handcuffs still lying on the concrete, photographing the badges pinned to each uniform, and noting the make and model of each SUV parked at its aggressive angle. He asked Crystal to explain, specifically, what training her staff had received in de-escalation or lawful detention procedures, a question that produced only a long, uncomfortable pause. She admitted, eventually, that her team's training consisted mostly of crowd management for private events, nothing resembling the authority to restrain a citizen who had committed no crime. Ryan made note of this in a small pad he carried, his expression unreadable, the kind of careful neutrality officers learn to maintain when a situation is far worse than it first appeared. Somewhere behind him, one of the gathered neighbors murmured that this was the most excitement Birchwood Lane had seen since a tree fell on the Hendersons' garage the previous spring, though nobody laughed. Ryan listened patiently for a moment, before cutting through the noise with a single, pointed question that silenced the driveway entirely. He asked Vanessa directly whether the Homeowners Association had ever obtained a court order, a judgment, or any form of legal authorization permitting physical detention of a resident over unpaid fines. Vanessa opened her mouth to answer, and then closed it again, the reality of what she had orchestrated finally beginning to land. Crystal, sensing the direction things were heading, tried to distance herself by insisting she had only done what Vanessa hired her to do, that this had never been her idea in the first place. The two women who had accompanied her stood silently to the side, neither willing to speak, both looking as though they wished they were anywhere else on Earth. Ryan instructed everyone to stay put while he reviewed the footage. Several neighbors had already gathered on their phones, footage that told a story far more damning than anything Vanessa had prepared herself to explain. The videos showed Crystal grabbing Ethan first, showed the two other women attempting to force handcuffs onto him without provocation, and showed Ethan doing nothing more than deflecting and separating himself from unlawful contact. They showed Vanessa shouting orders to restrain him, her voice unmistakable on every recording, and they showed her doing so while wearing no uniform, holding no legal authority, and citing no actual law. Ryan watched 3 separate versions of the same sequence of events, each one corroborating the last, and by the time he finished, his expression had shifted from cautious neutrality to something closer to controlled disbelief. He looked up from the phone screen and asked, in a voice that carried clearly across the driveway, who exactly had given the Homeowners Association the impression they were allowed to operate like a private police force. Nobody answered immediately, the silence stretching long enough to feel like its own kind of confession. Linda Shaw finally spoke, her voice thin and shaking, insisting that this had all been Vanessa's plan, and that she herself had barely been involved beyond attending the meeting where it was discussed. Vanessa spun toward her, betrayal flashing across her face, accusing Linda of approving every part of it without objection. Crystal, not to be left holding all the blame, announced that she had only agreed to the job because Vanessa promised the association had proper authorization for this kind of operation, an assertion that visibly enraged Vanessa even further. Officer Ryan simply stood back and let them unravel each other for a moment. Having seen this exact pattern before, people who worked in concert to cause harm suddenly scrambling to prove they alone were innocent once consequences arrived. Once the immediate chaos settled, Ryan turned his attention back to Ethan, who had remained calm and largely silent through the entire exchange, offering only brief, factual answers when directly questioned. He asked how Ethan had managed to handle 3 separate physical confrontations without throwing a single punch or causing any visible injury, a skill set that struck him as unusual for an ordinary homeowner. Ethan answered simply that he had spent many years learning how to control a situation without escalating it, and that avoiding harm to anyone, even people trying to harm him, had simply become instinct. George Ferris, who had walked over from his porch once things calmed down, spoke up before Ethan could downplay it any further. He told the officer that Ethan had served for years in the United States Marine Corps, that he had never once mentioned it himself, and that everyone on the street had simply assumed he was a quiet, generous new neighbor, with nothing more remarkable to his story. Ryan nodded slowly, several small details suddenly clicking into place, the economy of movement, the refusal to escalate, the calm precision under a level of pressure that would have caused most people to panic or lash out. He told Ethan, with clear and genuine respect in his voice, that his restraint was very likely the only reason nobody had been seriously hurt that morning. He explained that under different circumstances, with a less controlled individual on the receiving end, a scene like this could easily have ended in real injury or worse. Ethan simply shrugged and said he had not done anything special, only what he had been trained to do for most of his adult life. The small crowd of neighbors who had gathered along the sidewalk, phones still raised, exchanged looks of quiet, growing admiration, the story of the calm veteran and the collapsing homeowners association already beginning to spread before Ryan had even finished his report. The following days moved quickly, the way scandals often do once the first crack appears in a wall people had assumed was solid. Copies of the driveway footage circulated among residents within hours, passed from phone to phone until nearly every household in Maple Hollow had seen some version of the confrontation. What struck people most was not simply the attempted detention, but the layers of manufactured authority behind it. The fake badges, the costume uniforms, the handcuffs meant for a person who had committed no crime beyond questioning a $50 fine. Longtime residents who had quietly tolerated years of petty enforcement suddenly found the courage to speak about their own experiences, comparing notes they had never shared with one another before. It became clear, almost overnight, that Ethan's driveway had not been an isolated incident, but the moment an entire pattern of behavior finally came into the light. Officer Ryan Cole filed his formal report the same afternoon, documenting the fabricated badges, the unregistered vehicles, and the attempted physical restraint of a resident who had broken no law. In the report, he noted specifically that the association's actions could constitute impersonation of a peace officer under state law, along with potential charges of unlawful restraint against the 3 women involved. He forwarded a copy to the district attorney's office along with the video evidence gathered from multiple neighbors, recommending a full review of whether criminal charges were warranted beyond any civil penalties the county might pursue separately. Within 2 weeks, Crystal received a formal letter informing her that her company was under investigation, and Vanessa was contacted directly by an investigator asking her to explain, in detail, who had approved the purchase of uniforms and equipment designed to resemble official law enforcement gear. Neither woman had an answer that satisfied the investigator, and both were warned that further incidents of this nature would result in charges being filed without further warning. An emergency meeting was called at the clubhouse the following Thursday evening, the kind of meeting that normally drew a handful of bored attendees, but this time filled every folding chair in the room and left dozens more standing along the walls. Vanessa Holloway sat at the head table as she always had, though her posture had lost the confident rigidity residents had grown used to seeing. One by one, neighbors stood to share stories that had been quietly accumulated over years. Fines issued for holiday decorations left up a single extra day, threats made over paint colors that varied by shades nobody could actually see, an elderly resident charged repeatedly for a garden gnome deemed inappropriate under vague aesthetic guidelines. Each story added weight to the last, and the room's collective anger grew steadier and more resolute with every voice that spoke. A woman near the back, who introduced herself only as a resident of nearly a decade, stood and asked the question that seemed to hang over the entire meeting. She asked how many other residents had been threatened, however subtly, with the kind of enforcement action attempted against Ethan Brooks, and whether the association had authorized similar tactics before this particular case happened to be caught on camera. Vanessa attempted to answer, her voice noticeably less commanding than it had ever been in these meetings, insisting the security team had been hired only as a precaution and had never been meant to physically detain anyone. The footage playing quietly on a laptop connected to the clubhouse projector told a different story entirely, and several residents pointed at the screen as she spoke, making clear that no one in the room believed her anymore. Another man stood, his voice unsteady, and described an afternoon 2 years earlier when Vanessa herself had come to his door, threatening to place a lien on his home over a fence panel painted a shade she considered unauthorized, though he had used paint sold at the very hardware store the association recommended. A mother of 3 described being followed through the neighborhood by Linda Shaw, who photographed her children's bicycles left in the driveway, and later cited the family for what the notice called an unsightly obstruction. An older woman, her voix and a voice trembling with a mixture of anger and relief at finally being heard, explained that she had paid nearly $400 in cumulative fines over 3 years for a garden gnome she had inherited from her late husband, a fine she paid every time rather than risk further conflict. Each story, spoken aloud for the first time in front of a room full of witnesses, seemed to lift a small weight the speaker had been carrying alone for far too long. By the time the meeting reached its scheduled vote of no confidence, The outcome felt less like a decision and more like a formality everyone had already settled in their minds days earlier. Vanessa Holloway was removed from her position as president that same evening, the vote passing with an overwhelming majority that included even a few of the board members who had once been her closest allies. Linda Shaw resigned voluntarily, before any formal action could be taken against her, standing briefly to apologize to the room, her voice thick with the kind of regret that comes only once consequences are unavoidable. She admitted she had known things were wrong for years and had said nothing because it was easier to nod along than to risk becoming a target herself. Crystal's security staffing company lost its contract within days, and word quickly spread through the local business community about the fake badges and unauthorized uniforms, effectively ending her ability to find similar work in the area. The county's Consumer Protection Office, alerted by more than one concerned resident, opened an inquiry into whether her company had violated laws around impersonating law enforcement, a process that would follow her for months afterward. Vanessa Holloway was removed from her position as president that same evening, the vote passing with an overwhelming majority that included even a few of the board members who had once been her closest allies. Linda Shaw resigned voluntarily before any formal action could be taken against her, standing briefly to apologize to the room, her voice thick with the kind of regret that comes only once consequences are unavoidable. She admitted she had known things were wrong for years and had said nothing because it was easier to nod along than to risk becoming a target herself. Crystal's security staffing company lost its contract within days, and word quickly spread through the local business community about the fake badges and unauthorized uniforms, effectively ending her ability to find similar work in the area. The county's Consumer Protection Office, alerted by more than one concerned resident, opened an inquiry into whether her company had violated laws around impersonating law enforcement, a process that would follow her for months afterward. Vanessa's difficulties did not end with her removal from the board. Two other residents, emboldened by the meeting and the footage now widely circulated, filed formal complaints with the county detailing years of what they described as harassment disguised as enforcement. A local news station picked up a shortened version of the story, blurring faces but airing enough of the driveway footage that friends and coworkers recognized her almost immediately. She stopped attending the neighborhood's summer block party that year, and the following spring she quietly listed her house for sale, moving out before most residents had a chance to say goodbye, or, in some cases, before they had a chance to say anything at all. A few residents later admitted they felt a flicker of pity watching the moving truck pull away, remembering that Vanessa had once organized a genuinely well-run holiday drive for a family who lost their home to a fire, proof that even people capable of real cruelty were rarely cruel in every part of their lives. That flicker of pity never translated into forgiveness for what had happened in Ethan's driveway, but it did remind a few residents that karma, however satisfying, rarely arrived as a clean, simple ending. Crystal, meanwhile, was ordered by the county to cease using any uniform, badge, or vehicle that could reasonably be mistaken for law enforcement equipment, a restriction that effectively dismantled the part of her business Vanessa had once found so impressive. Linda, unlike the other two, stayed in the neighborhood, and over the following months made a quiet, consistent effort to rebuild the trust she had spent years chipping away at, volunteering for cleanup days and never again raising her voice at a single resident. Ethan, for his part, wanted none of the attention the story had begun to attract, declining several requests from local reporters who had caught wind of the viral footage circulating online. He continued mowing George's lawn every week, continued fixing fences and jump-starting cars, and continued behaving exactly as he had before any of this happened, as though the entire episode were simply one more task completed and set aside. George liked to tell people afterward that this, more than the driveway incident itself, was the clearest proof of the kind of man Ethan truly was. A person who could remain unaffected by both public humiliation and public praise, treating each with the same quiet indifference, was a rarer thing than most people ever encountered in their lives. At the next scheduled association meeting, weeks later, residents gathered to elect a new board, and more than one person nominated Ethan for the open position of president. He declined gently but firmly, explaining that he had never wanted power over his neighbors, only a place where people treated each other with basic decency. He told the room, in the same understated tone he used for nearly everything, that he simply wanted to live somewhere people respected one another without needing rules enforced through fear or intimidation. The applause that followed was quiet but genuine, the kind reserved for someone who had clearly meant every word. A younger resident, new to the neighborhood, was eventually elected instead, promising a complete rewrite of the association's bylaws with an emphasis on fairness, transparency, and a formal appeals process for any future fine. The new board spent the following months meeting regularly in the clubhouse, poring over the old bylaws line by line, striking out vague language that had allowed Vanessa so much room to invent violations wherever she pleased. They introduced a written appeals process, requiring any fine to be documented with photographs and a specific cited rule before it could be issued at all, along with a mandatory 72-hour window for residents to respond before any penalty took effect. They eliminated the practice of unannounced property inspections entirely, replacing it with a system where residents could request review of any complaint through a public, recorded process rather than a private phone call from the association president. Ethan attended a handful of these meetings as an ordinary resident, offering input only when asked, content to let the neighborhood rebuild its own sense of fairness without him standing at the center of it. By the time the new bylaws were formally adopted at a vote the following autumn, barely anyone in the room needed reminding of why the changes had become necessary in the first place. Months passed, and Maple Hollow slowly settled into something calmer and more human than it had been under Vanessa Holloway's rule. Fines became rare, almost quaint compared to the frequency of years past, reserved now for genuine safety concerns rather than the color of a mailbox or the timing of a trash can. George Ferris continued sitting on his porch most afternoons, though now his gaze carried less watchfulness and more simple contentment, the neighborhood around him finally resembling the community he remembered from decades earlier. Children rode bicycles down Birchwood Lane without anyone shouting about noise ordinances, and neighbors waved to each other with an ease that had been missing for longer than most of them cared to admit. Ethan remained exactly who he had always been, through it all, the quiet man who fixed what needed fixing and never asked for anything in return. One afternoon in early spring, a young family pulled a moving truck into the driveway of the house across the street, unloading boxes with the nervous energy of people starting somewhere entirely new. Ethan walked over without being asked, as he always did, offering to help carry the heavier furniture inside, while their two children ran circles around the yard. The husband, wiping sweat from his forehead as they set down a dresser, asked him casually where he had learned to lift like that, so effortlessly, as though the weight barely registered. Ethan smiled. The same small, unassuming smile George had grown so familiar with, and admitted that he had spent some years in the Marine Corps, though it had been a long time since any of that mattered day to day. The man's eyes widened slightly, recognition flickering, having clearly heard some version of the story that had passed through the neighborhood months before. He asked, half in disbelief, whether Ethan was the same man from the video everyone still occasionally mentioned, the one who had calmly dismantled an entire fake enforcement squad without throwing a single punch. Ethan laughed softly and shook his head, waving off the question as though it belonged to someone else entirely. He told the man that whoever that person in the video had been, he was simply a neighbor now, someone who liked quiet mornings, a well-kept lawn, and a street where people looked out for one another. The man studied him for a moment longer, then extended a hand and thanked him for the help with the dresser, understanding somehow that the conversation had reached its natural end. Ethan shook his hand, picked up another box without being asked, and carried it inside as though nothing remarkable had happened at all. Later that same afternoon, the new family's youngest daughter wandered into Ethan's yard chasing a stray soccer ball, and he knelt down to roll it gently back to her without a word of complaint about the fence or the property line, the very things that would once have earned a $50 fine under the old regime. Her mother called out an apology from across the street, and Ethan simply waved it off, telling her that children chasing balls into yards was exactly the kind of thing a neighborhood ought to allow. George, watching from his porch as he so often did, smiled to himself at the sight, thinking that this small, unremarkable exchange said more about what Maple Hollow had become than any meeting or vote ever could. It was the kind of moment that would never make it into a video or a news report, and yet it was exactly the kind of moment the entire ordeal had ultimately been fought to protect. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops of Maple Hollow, Ethan sat on his own porch with a cup of coffee, watching the street settle into its familiar quiet rhythm. An American flag hung near his front door, moving gently in the evening breeze, its motion the only sound besides the distant laughter of children finishing their last game before dinner. George waved from his porch across the street, and Ethan raised his mug in return, the simple gesture carrying more warmth than either man needed to put into words. Nothing about the scene suggested anything extraordinary had ever happened here. No fake badges, no handcuffs clattering on concrete, no fear disguised as authority. Ethan thought, sometimes, about the years that had shaped the man now sitting quietly on this porch, the deployments, the long nights, the discipline drilled into him until it became something closer to instinct than memory. He did not think of those years with regret, nor did he think of them often at all, but on evenings like this one, he understood clearly what they had given him beyond the obvious skills that had ended a confrontation without a single injury. They had given him patience, the kind that let a $50 fine roll off him without anger, and they had given him the certainty that real strength rarely needed to announce itself. He had learned long ago that the loudest person in a room was rarely the one actually in control of it, a lesson Vanessa Holloway had spent years failing to learn and had finally been forced to confront in his driveway. It was not a lesson he had ever wanted to teach anyone, only one he happened to embody simply by remaining exactly who he already was. And yet everyone on that street understood, in their own quiet way, that the calm now settled over Maple Hollow had been earned rather than given, built not through domination, but through the steady, unshakable strength of a man who never needed to raise his voice to prove he was right.